This credit encourages projects to buy green power, carbon offsets, and/or renewable energy certificates that correspond to either 50% or 100% of the project's energy use. As mentioned, renewable energy certificates represent a tradable, non-tangible commodity associated with the qualities of renewable energy generation. A REC is a proof that when purchased, an amount of energy was created using renewable energy sources. If the local utility in a project team's location does not sell green power, then the project team can offset the building's energy use by purchasing green power from renewable energy projects around the country. Green E is the leading certification program for green power generation in the United States, and under this credit, LEED requires projects to use Green E Energy Certified or equivalent green power. Again, carbon offsets allow projects to fund companies or organizations that reduce or remove carbon emissions. An example organization or company may work on reforestation or any other activity that would support both the environment and the atmosphere. A carbon offset is a reduction of carbon dioxide made in order to compensate for or offset an equivalent carbon dioxide emission made elsewhere. Since energy use of the green building will result in carbon emissions, green buildings can calculate their carbon emissions from their energy use and purchase the same amount of carbon offsets to compensate for their emissions. For a carbon offset to qualify in this credit, it needs to be Green E Climate Certified or equivalent. In the credit, different types of energy uses are categorized under different scopes. The displayed table shows the types of energies and their corresponding scopes. A Scope 1 energy source relates to direct energy from owned or controlled sources. A Scope 2 energy source relates to purchased energy. And a Scope 3 energy source relates to energy sources that are not owned or directly controlled. To illustrate, the energy generated on-site through burning fossil fuels will fall under Scope 1 energy sources, and the resulting greenhouse gas emissions will be classified as Scope 1 emissions. The electricity bought from a utility company will be classified as a Scope 2 energy source, and the resulting greenhouse gas emission will be Scope 2 emissions. Let's take a closer look at this credit. Credit intent: to encourage the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with the use of grid source, renewable energy technologies, and carbon reduction projects. Credit requirements: projects should engage in a contract for a minimum of 5 years to be delivered at least annually from the qualified sources that have come online since January 1st, 2005. The contract should specify the provision of at least 50% or 100% of the project's energy from green power, carbon offsets, and/or renewable energy certificates. Green power and RECs should be Green E Energy Certified or the equivalent. And RECs can only be used to mitigate the effects of Scope 2 electricity use only, while the carbon offsets may be used to mitigate Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions on a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent basis, and they can be used for both electricity and non-electricity energy sources, such as natural gas. This is also important to know for the exam purposes. And all the purchased carbon offsets should be Green E Climate Certified or equivalent. For projects located in the United States, the carbon offsets should be from greenhouse gas emissions reduction projects within the United States, while for the projects outside the United States, purchasing carbon offsets from the country that the project is located in is not mandatory. Projects should determine the percentage of green power or offsets based on the quantity of energy consumed. Note that calculating the energy based on energy quantity is not the case for some other LEED prerequisites and credits, like the Renewable Energy Production Credit or the Minimum Energy Performance Prerequisite, which require energy calculations based on energy costs, not quantities. Points are awarded according to the table displayed. To illustrate, let's assume that teams for Project A want to address 50% of the building's total energy through green power, RECs, and/or carbon offsets. In this scenario, If the project is only using both grid source electricity and natural gas, the project team can choose to address both the electricity and natural gas by only buying carbon offsets for 50% of total energy use. Or the project team may decide to buy RECs for 50% of the electricity use and carbon offsets for 50% of the natural gas use. RECs cannot be used to mitigate the effects of natural gas and therefore can only address Scope 2 electricity use. Or the project team may decide to buy a combination of RECs for electricity use and carbon offsets for natural gas and/or electricity use, which works as long as their total adds up to 50% of the building's total energy. If option 1 of the minimum energy performance prerequisite was pursued, the energy model can be used to calculate the amount of green power, RECs, and/or carbon offsets required under this credit. Otherwise, projects can use the CBEX database to estimate the total building energy cost. Similar to the other LEED credits requiring energy calculation, CBEX is used to determine energy usage of the building if the project does not have an energy model. Remember that in the Renewable Energy Production Credit, projects had to retain the environmental benefits associated with the generated renewable energy on site if generated. And if the environmental benefits were sold, the project teams had to purchase an equivalent amount of renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets. Selling RECs for the renewable energy created on site really means that the environmental benefits of the generated energy do not belong to the project anymore. But if the project retains the environmental benefits associated with the generated renewable energy on site, this will mean that under this credit, the project team will not need to buy RECs or carbon offsets for the renewable energy generated on site. Therefore, project teams would exclude any renewable energy quantity serving the project from their calculations. If a project is a net zero energy project, which means that the project only uses its own generated renewable energy, the project will automatically receive full points under this credit. All other types of non-renewable energy used by the building should be included in the calculations, such as non-electric energy, steam purchased from the utility, fuel purchased for on-site energy generation, or anything similar. Now, let's take a look at the required documentation for this credit. Because the credit's calculations are based on energy usage, not cost, project teams need to document their annual electricity and non-electricity energy use calculations and the calculations showing their required REC, green power, or carbon offsets according to their target points. Additionally, project teams need to document their purchase contract or letter of commitment showing the corresponding REC, green power, and/or carbon offset amounts. If Green E products are not available, projects outside the United States can use a local benchmark by documenting Green E equivalency. Before finishing up this credit, it is also important to note that this credit does not qualify for exemplary performance. Lastly, let's take a look at the key things to remember for this credit. 1. Credit calculations are based on energy usage, not cost. 2. RECs and green power are measured in megawatt hour or kilowatt hour, while the carbon offsets are measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. 3. Electricity usage can be addressed by RECs, green power, and/or carbon offsets. 4. Carbon offsets may be used to mitigate Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions on a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent basis, and they can be used for both electricity and non-electricity energy sources. 5. Green E energy certification is required for green power and RECs, while Green E climate certification is required for carbon offsets. 6. Know the usage of CBEX. And 7. Know the sources of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.